Everybody, welcome. Today we have Pouya Ahmadi to speak with us. Pouya is a designer, artist, and associate professor of graphic design at Rhode Island School of Design, or RISD. He's the founder of Studio Pouya Ahmadi and the editor, designer, and publisher of Amalgam, an independent journal that explores the intersection of typography, language, and power. Amalgam has been recognized by AIGA, the Society of Typographic Arts, UIC Office of the Vice Provost and Faculty Affairs, and UIC College of Architecture, Design, and the Arts, Dean's Research Prize. Pouya has presented at venues including Typographics, Adobe Live, and TypeCon, and his work has been exhibited at Moscow Global Biennial of Graphic Design, Dubai Design Week, AIGA Ion Design, the Type Directors Club, and East Sea International Art Biennial, among others. He served as an editorial board member of Nation magazine in Iran from 2009 to 2020. Pouya holds an MA in image research and an MAS in visual communication from the University of Applied Sciences and the Arts Northwestern Switzerland, and an MDS in graphic design from the University of Illinois at Chicago. I'm Lillian Crum, and I'm the Associate Dean of the College of Architecture and Design here at LTU and the Director of the Graphic Design Program. At the college, we believe that the future of design is multidisciplinary, and we host a range of design degrees that include graphic design, product design, transportation design, game design, interior design, and architecture. We track design future trends, emerging technologies, and advancements in practice as a means of crafting education approaches in these areas. Our Design by Technology lecture series allows us to engage in design discussions and offer broad perspectives on where we are headed. So a few upcoming events to put on your radar. You all have little flyers near your seats. The first one is coming up this week on Thursday. It's a social media workshop called Elevate Your Profile, Social Media Self-Promotion. It's at 12:30 on Thursday, and it's presented by Dr. Sarah Kodarin and Professor Noor Saltik. And we'll have special guest speakers, Dr. Karen Reed Hendon of the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, as well as Jim Ritz from the Office of Career Services. So please take advantage. There will be pizza as well. And then next week we have a workshop about AI for designers getting started, and that is facilitated by Carl Dobman. And with that, I will let you take it over. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks, Lillian, for the intro. I don't know if this microphone is it working? So anyway, my name is Pouya Ahmadi, and the title of this talk is Transnational Typography. I'm going to elaborate on this later on, but I'm assuming most of you have heard this term in different contexts. But just to give you a little bit of a background about myself, I was born and raised in Iran, and that's where I studied graphic design at the University of Tehran. And almost right away after my education in graphic design, I moved to Switzerland, to University of Northwestern Switzerland, where I studied visual communication and image research. And after 4 years of spending, like, kind of immersing myself in European design culture, I moved to the US. Moved to Chicago, where I lived and worked as a designer and educator, established my practice as an independent designer and publisher. And about a year ago, I moved to Providence, where I'm teaching at RISD and continuing my practice as a publisher and artist. So that was just kind of a brief intro in terms of my basically places that I've been, which I think are a big part of my identity and my design practice. And to give you a little bit more specific examples of the influences that I had in the past on my work. I want to show you some of the examples that of painting, art, and calligraphy, and the sort of the space between the two that I've been exposed to growing up in Iran. And what's important to me here is to kind of focus on the aesthetics, but also language as sort of material for this particular form of creation of painting. This is a very specific genre which has had a long history in Iran. It's called calligraphic painting. Artists using language as a form to create compositions deliberately. So Charles Hossein Zenderudi is actually one of the really probably most prominent figures who has created many pieces in this area. Another artist to mention is Mohammad Esai, who I actually studied with in Tehran when I was doing my graphic design degree at the University of Tehran. Again, I want to emphasize on the complexity of these calligraphic paintings, and also the richness, the color. I mean, it's all kind of hints. They basically hint at the culture in very specific ways that I grew up in many different ways. But I've also had a lot of influences in terms of literature and writing. Two of the figures that I would say, mostly influenced my sort of growing up in Tehran and formulating my understanding of my culture and my identity, again, as an Iranian artist and a designer, were Ahmadi Shamlu, who is a writer and a poet. This particular book has been quite influential. For me, it's a poetry collection. The title is Mirror Orchard. It was published before the revolution in Iran, the '79 revolution. And it, in very poetic ways, kind of hints at social and political unrest. Another book that was published much earlier during a previous regime, before Pahlavi regime in Iran, was The Blind Owl. Again, like, this was another publication that metaphorically hinted at a lot of social and political upheaval in Iran. And what is really common, I guess, when you look at the history of Persian writing and literature, is that metaphors actually play a humongous role in the way that artists speak to difficult, sometimes controversial political issues, because of a lot of obviously challenges when it comes to those particular the freedom of speech, let's say, throughout the history. And this is not a new thing in Iran. Like, when we think about contemporary Iran, everyone kind of associates it with the current regime, but these forms of oppressions have had long history in the Iran in the country. So these, again, to me, have been very influential. Another very important figure to me was Forough Farrokhzad, who was a young filmmaker, author, writer, who died unfortunately very young, in her late 20s. She made one short film, which was called The House is Black, and this kind of became the signature and circulated heavily, not just in the region, but also in the West, because it portrayed the contemporary filmmaking in the Middle East, especially in Iran, of course, in a very particular way. The concept of this film is questioning notions of beauty. So she filmed this remote leper community in the north of Iran, and explored these issues of othering, alienation that was happening, to that community. Just to mention one more figure, I'm assuming most people know Shir Neshad. She's an Iranian American artist. She's known for her video installations mostly, but also photography. Again, what's interesting to me here, just kind of tying it back to the title of this talk, which is Transnational Typography, is the way in which diaspora communities speak to their cultures, their heritage in a very specific way, finding ways to connect with their culture, sometimes through language and sometimes through imagery. And I think Shirin Nishad is a really great example. If you've seen her work, you probably know what I'm talking about, but if you haven't, I highly recommend looking her up. So just to kind of jump ahead a little bit and talk about more specific work that is related to my practice. So my practice kind of operates in two parallel ways or modes, if you may. So self-initiated projects is one of the areas that I'm very much interested in. Most of my practice is focused in that space, where I collaborate with different artists and designers, coming up with a project together usually. And they tend to explore themes of hybridity, collective identity, and liminality. And again, I'm going to elaborate on those as I get to some of these projects. But also a lot of the influence comes from language and writing. So I'm very much interested in the writings of authors such as Sarah Ahmed, Mark Fisher, Mariana Ortega. I'll mention some of them throughout the presentation. So these are some of the earlier attempts when I was trying to connect with my own understanding of language and culture, where I came from. This is a poetry, or this piece of poetry by Ahmad Shamli, which I showed earlier. It's called Roxana. It's actually a love story, but it's almost like a sort of commentary on a social-political unrest in Iran, but through this kind of love story that falls apart. And so this was an attempt to find a way to typographically speak to these sort of issues that the author Ahmad Shamli brings up in the story, the turmoil, but purely through language and typography. Some of the earlier work that I've done, again, we're heavily kind of focused on typography and very specific styles. So for instance, this one is a Kufic style, which was mostly used in architecture in the Middle East. If you are familiar with Kufic, it was originally developed to facilitate the sort of integration of language into architecture. So that was for me a very exciting piece where I could work with language and space simultaneously, and to do so I kept exploring these spaces where language and sort of space could collide or form a particular narrative in a way. So I made several poster series, as you can see here. This one, Figures of Speech, was again an attempt to think about like formation of language in one's mind, and the way it kind of articulates itself as almost like some piece of architecture, or when you think about language and how you build a sentence, let's say, or a piece of poetry or anything you can think of like prose. It's almost like that process is almost like building something to get, piecing together, particular, words and sentences. And to me, that seems like very much similar to what, architects do, but it's happening through language. So this was an attempt to kind of, bring those two worlds in my mind, at least together. And so further on, I became more and more interested in the history of language, like how the Arabic influenced the culture of Iranian culture, cultural production, and as you know, like Iran has had a long history in writing and language prior to the introduction of Islam and Arabic writing system. So for me, this was kind of a moment of research and understanding how one thing led to another, and this sort of a speculative projection of where the language or the writing system could go potentially in the future. So focusing kind of like this project was mainly focused on this idea of ligatures, because ligatures play a very important role in Arabic and Farsi writing system. And my goal with this project was to develop a language that heavily relies on these ligatures and connections between the letter forms. So these are some attempts at, exploring those possible, evolution of the language in very much typographic way. So for me, I'm going to bring it back again to this idea of transnational versus national identity. This magazine was a big moment in my career, and also understanding myself, positioning myself as not just an Iranian artist, but someone who is interested in the entire world, like the history of the world, not beyond my, cultural identity or ethnicity. And to me, this magazine was a great opportunity. This is actually the first official Iranian graphic design magazine that was established in 2001, and its goal was to connect, the graphic design community with the rest of the world, with the Middle East and the rest of the world. So the contributions were coming from, writers from within the country and other countries in the Middle East, but also like Europe and the US. So it was a really interesting amalgamation of content where, people from outside of Iran could learn about what's happening in Iran, which was quite a bit of a challenge at the time when this publication was published, because that communication wasn't happening really, unfortunately. So this was quite a bit of an eye-opening moment for me to formulate my practice and interest moving forward as a graphic designer, and especially in the context of publishing and finding ways to go beyond my sort of understanding of national or local identity towards something that is more expansive. So here I want to kind of, I'm using that as a project as a way to kind of talk about this kind of transition to more transnational identity and migration and so forth. This code for me is super exciting, and I think always, to me it reminds me of my limitations as someone who lived in Iran for quite a while until I was like in my mid-20s and had a very kind of like a specific understanding of issues until I migrated to Europe, and everything became a lot more complex, of course, richer and complex, and in many ways exciting. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the projects that I specifically were developing, focusing on this idea of, again, like transnationality. And I'm using this term kind of loosely. You might have heard this term being, sort of used interchangeably with, diaspora sort of identity, like when we were talking about transnational studies and diaspora studies. But they're kind of different. I'm using transnational identity as this kind of umbrella term that kind of includes diaspora identity. Diaspora identity is more about like a group of, a community that has a strong ties through their heritage and their connection to a country of origin, versus transnational identities are more about like communities that are connected beyond borders. So they're not necessarily sharing the same heritage, but they're connected in terms of like their goals and ambitions and exchange of culture and other social forms of exchange. So this series of work basically explores this idea of the questioning of the dichotomies of East and West, body and mind. They're very much built in, or I would say at least the culture that I come from, and I'm assuming this is also very much common in the West, where there are these kind of like dichotomies of mind and body, and there are a lot of like contemporary literature and philosophy is trying to question that and many interesting ways, that these are actually not as separate as we would like to think of them. So this was kind of a research project that I started with my sister quite a while ago, where we started reading many different texts. One of the most, or some of the most influential texts that we came across were actually written by non-Iranian authors like Mariana Ortega, who wrote specifically about Chicano identities in the US, and this idea of, like, she coined the term multiplicitous identities, where people that have these multiple identities or layered identities have this ability to understand their the culture or society that they live in a much more complex and rich way, because they have these multi-angle perspective on issues. So that was quite a bit an exciting find when we were researching this idea of like transnational identity. There were also like many different influences, including Mark Fisher, who wrote quite a bit about this idea of curtain. He talks specifically about American cultures, but pop culture, but specifically about David Lynch's use of curtains in his movies, where basically through which multiple worlds collide. And that was also very much interesting to us, because we are also like David Lynch fans. So kind of bringing that sort of perspective into what we were already interested in terms of like what parda, which is the title of this project. In Farsi it means veil or curtain, could potentially mean. Veil has a very also long history in Iran. In Sufism, there's a rich sort of understanding of what a veil is. It separates you from the divine in a certain way, and there's always this kind of like barrier. But what is also interesting about it is that all these different spaces that are being separated by these curtains are actually two sides of the same thing. And I think that's what we were trying to get at. This is an interactive piece. It's a curtain, it's a canvas curtain, and the viewers are encouraged to actually turn it over and read the other side of the curtain. And again, like the idea is to kind of point out the false dichotomies of East and West, and material, body, mind, everything that is sort of traditionally been staged as this idea of like, separate. This other project was actually a collaboration with Renata Gra, who is a Brazilian-American Chicago artist based in Chicago, and my sister again, Pega Ahmadi. So we were interested in this idea of like borders, again, like transnational identities, collective identities, and how we can bring, all of that together in a sort of like a typographic installation work. This wasn't, we actually had an invitation from the Design Museum of Chicago, and this piece was actually developed for an exhibition that was curated around this idea of paperworks. So the only limitation was basically like the material for the piece had to be paper, made up, the piece had to be made of paper. So we built this 28 sheets installation that morphs the last letter of Portuguese alphabet, which is the same as the Latin English alphabet, the Z, and the first letter of Farsi and Arabic alphabet, Alif. So they kind of morph into each other, and the goal was to kind of point at this transition that one goes through as let's say as an immigrant. It's quite a bit of a strange transition. If you look at this particular view that goes, that shows the sort of like transition between these letter forms, you're going to see some really strange forms. And I guess we in our minds, we were kind of thinking about like how these transitions are actually not quite comfortable or not quite easy to verbalize. It's a very unique experience. But we were specifically talking about, these notions of integration and assimilation and the tension between the two, what you're expected, how you're expected to operate as the other in the society that has a very specific definition or a framework of what is considered human, what is not considered human. And as an extension of that project, we created a publication that also turned into an installation. So it's kind of like a hybrid piece. My sister, again, this was a collaboration with my sister. She wrote a piece about our journey, like as Iranian Americans. She's also based in the US. She's also interested in this hybrid modes of expressing one's identity. So we basically took that poem that she wrote, and it's partly written in Farsi, partly written in English. There are multiple characters throughout this writing that they basically sort of morph into each other. It's one person's journey, but this person kind of, the character almost changes multiple times throughout the story. And every time this person or this main character changes identity, a different typeface emerges throughout the publication. So if you look at the publication, you're going to see multiple iterations of the Latin version of the typeface. So there's a rounded, there's a hybrid cut, and then there's a angular cut. And again, like these basically match with a particular stage of, the story of this character sort of evolution, and also the experiences that she's going through. And then it's also accompanied by a Farsi or Arabic alphabet or typeface. And so again, like that sort of thinking about this transition from one culture to another, you're obviously, it's almost like a portal that you go through. You're displaced from one location to another, but also at the same time, you're, mentally almost like dissociated from where you grew up, from the culture that you belong to, or you thought you belonged to, and then you're kind of, completely basically surrounded by a lot of different ways of expression of identities. And I think that to us, that's something actually really exciting. And we tend to kind of build on that idea of multiplicity and pluralistic ways of explore or expressing identity. But of course, you still have connections to your heritage and your background and your country of origin, and it's never possible to kind of dissociate yourself. And this is maybe an example of that moment where that I was actually commissioned last year by a gallery in Chicago to create a mural as part of this group exhibition that the gallery organized. It was a collaboration with the artist duo Sun and Zimmer, if anyone is familiar with them, based in Chicago. So I basically gave them the instruction to implement the mural, as you can see in the video. So the theme of this was actually, the title is Jonathan. Jonathan means body and mind in Farsi. This was a sort of reflection on what was happening in Iran, the women life movement, women life freedom movement, and sort of this idea of bodily autonomy, how it, the importance of it, but also how it's some of the most fundamental human rights that unfortunately is taken away from women and non-binary people in Iran. So this basically the mural, I don't know if you can see the tulips, but tulips are sort of the symbol of solidarity, but also revolution, that are also spelling the word zan, which in Farsi means woman. And then the script is basically what I just mentioned earlier, Jonathan, body and mind. So again, this is kind of like a way to think about what it means to be in transnational identity with ties to somewhere that you grew up, you have a history with, but you're still, their struggle still are your struggle, even though you're so far removed. And so from there, I kind of want to transition to my publishing practice. So most of the work that I showed earlier, I consider them as artistic projects, installation. Even though there's some like component of publication design, I still don't really see them as publishing in that sort of traditional sense. But I do work as a publisher and designer and editor. This is a journal that has been for a long time a project that I've been thinking about developing, and finally in 2016 I had the opportunity to finally bring it to life. So Amalgam is basically a journal that explores I think of it as a transnational identity because it's not really focused on a particular identity category. It's really a platform for bringing forth identities that are historically marginalized. So you'll see contributions by BIPOC, Alana, queer, and LGBTQIA+, and immigrants. I mean, it's a really broad range of identities that the journal is trying to cover, but the lens is still this kind of like lens of typography and language and power. So power in terms of, it can be in a spectrum, right? Power, it could be about, building collective power within these communities or across these communities, but it's also could be, the other way around, challenging hegemonic power. So these are sort of the goals. So in the first issue, I mean, of course, the journal has gone through its own evolution. But the first issue, there's, for instance, an essay by Alice Lee who talks about the history of Hangul writing system and its political and social history, and basically language performing liberation from under a hegemonic system of Japanese culture. So a nation creates a writing system as a way to gain independence or declare independence from another, let's say, hegemonic power. Or there is another piece by Paul McNeill about text, language, and search for utopia, how language has evolved over time as a utopian project in order to reach this kind of global language, something that everyone can have access to and can communicate through, which has failed many times over history, unfortunately, but it's interesting to look at its different attempts toward that ambitious goal. There are other contributions. David Jonathan Ross wrote about various contrast typefaces, which for many years it was kind of a stigma. No one wanted to look at reverse contrast typefaces because they're considered very ugly. But he was one of the people that actually really embraced them, and his practice focused on bringing these sort of like eccentric, let's say, typefaces into the mainstream. And so this was the first issue. And so again, I think of this journal not just as a simple publishing platform, but also as a way of connecting with different communities or building community. So a lot of the launch, I usually do multiple launch events. And this one was at the Design Museum of Chicago. It's great to kind of use these opportunities as a way to kind of, again, like connect with people that are interested in the same conversations, same topics. The second issue was, came out in 2019. So again, the journal, the idea of this journal is that it traces contemporary discourse around visual and typographic manifestations of language and power and their relationship. So a lot of the projects are transdisciplinary projects, and there are quite a few speculative proposals, and they're usually invited contributors that write or contribute artwork to this journal. And the shared interest is basically, this idea of mutability of language, instability of communication, and sort of prospects for equitable futures. So in this issue, there's a piece by Nat Piper. They wrote about mapping the history and future of queer zines in North America. Jerome Harris wrote about modernism in the US, the language of modernism and how it basically marginalized a lot of vernacular graphic design and became the language of corporate America. Laura Schorl wrote about her personal journey as an immigrant, and parallel to this, origins of all languages. It's kind of a fiction / autobiographical piece. It's kind of hard to explain exactly. She's a writer and a poet. That her writing kind of crosses multiple genres. And there's also contribution by Kiat Aspiku, who is a type designer, Iranian British type designer based in London. This was launched at Inga. It's a bookstore. I don't know if anyone is familiar. If you've been to Chicago, I highly recommend stopping by Inga. It's a sort of bookshop that promotes alternative and micro-publishing projects in the arts and humanities and design. And yeah, this was just an image. There's an image of the launch. So the third issue that came out 2 years ago, this was actually influenced by this strange piece that was published actually in the 11th century in Qabusname. Qabusname is it's a genre of literature that is known for Mirror for Princes, or I think that's what the genre is. And the idea is that it's kind of a critique of power. So this publication usually is passed down to the next ruler of the country, and I'm specifically talking about Iran, history of Iran. But this publication is basically passed down to the next rulers, and are ways in which, as a way to kind of let them know about, the next generation, about the failures and successes of the previous, leadership, or, whoever was in charge, in power. So it's also an interesting genre. It's a really strange kind of. It's not fiction. It's very much nonfiction, but it's mostly focused on ethics of power. This particular. So this is actually the last page of the publication that I found, and I found it quite interesting as an inspiration for designing the third issue of the journal, which focuses on tacit language. That's the theme of the journal. Tacit language is it's a translation that the best I could do translating a very specific term in Farsi. It's called Zabane bi Zabani. It's a term that is used for people that do not have power, but find a way to express this dissent through, very specific terminology or metaphoric ways. So it's kind of like a way of challenging power in a way, if you think about it, but not in a direct way. And so a lot of the contributions of the journal, some of them that I would like to mention or highlight are Mindy Siu's piece about feminist mail arts, the circulation or creation of network of power that kind of, became actually its own genre. I mean, if you're familiar with mail arts, for many years it was a very much male-dominant genre, but the whole feminist lineage came out of that. That Mindy Siu actually traced that lineage and wrote a really beautiful piece about it. There's another piece by Nicole Killian, who wrote about Tumblr as a platform for queer teens, and as a platform to connect and gain collective power and express their identity, desires, and power through the platform itself. There's a piece by Chris Lee who wrote about the intertwined relationship between typographic grids and cartography and colonization, how these elements are so intertwined. So map making and its relation with hegemonic power and control, forms of control. There's another piece by Ilham Nambar who wrote about libraries and power, how libraries have historically became site of power and have been historically, specifically in the context of the Middle East, have been destroyed by through terrorist attacks as a way to very much attacking or diminishing nations' source of power, in a way, knowledge. So this issue was launched at Typographics 2021 with a really kind and beautiful intro by Ellen Lupton. I'm assuming people are familiar with her, and 3 of the contributors of the journal. And so this one is the last one. This is going to be released actually this Friday. This one has been in the works for 2 years now, and I think this one is probably the most, for now, in my opinion, the most direct sort of take on the issues that I'm interested in tackling through the journal. I'm going to read a little bit of the intro that I wrote for this issue. So Amalgam 4 assembles a series of essays, anecdotal notes, conversations, and artworks that engage with, hint at, or revolve around the theme of collapse. From collapse of language, syntax, to collapse of semantics, barriers between languages and language itself, this collection reverberates the material and immaterial conditions, formations, reproductions, and dissemination of power through language and typography. A series of revolutionary headdresses, the auditory and polemic bonds between the words or letters in Arabic and Hebrew, the interiorities of illegibility, the downfall of the ancient Silk Road patterns, the West Asian goddesses, an asemic grief, a deliberately missing language, a hearty stutter, and an alif that wore a hat to school. So these are just kind of touching on different contributions by different artists and linguists that contributed to this issue. Some of them you might have heard from Camila Janan Rashid, which was just on the screen, Moreshin Allahyari, Anahita Razmi. And what's exciting about this project, especially this issue for me, is that I would say majority of the contributors are from the diaspora, but not from the same heritage. So Mashinka Frans Hakopian is an Armenian American. Marshina Lawyari is a Kurdish Iranian. Anaita Razmi is a German Iranian contributor, Slavs and Tatars. I'm not sure you're familiar with the artist collective. They're based in Berlin. They're a collective of 5 at the moment, I think. One Polish, I believe Russian, one French, and one Iranian, and one German, I think. Again, to me, this is it's an exciting moment where I can actually like really hone in on the issues that I'm interested about: transnational, identities, the challenges of being a transnational identity, but also opportunities where you can connect with pretty much every other, diaspora communities. Just to wrap it up with this final section, kind of want to bring it all together through some of the commission projects that I've been working on during the past couple of years, but also opportunities where I could again bring that kind of transnational interest into my practice, but in a professional practice. So the challenges of working as someone who is coming from a very particular part of the world with a very different, culture and writing system, language, you name it, is to find an opportunity to work with what you actually are most familiar with. And this was maybe one of those opportunities where I was commissioned by the Design Museum of Chicago. It was a collaboration with the Department of Cultural Affairs and Special Events, and the Chicago Department of Public Health that started to put out this campaign that encouraged people within different communities to vaccinate. This came out during COVID, obviously. So they were asking different people in the Chicago community to create these campaigns in the language of their preference, and actually speak to their community in their own language, which is a very rare opportunity to me. I mean, maybe once in a lifetime. So this kind of became an opportunity, and there was no restriction. It was very open-ended. And I created a poster series where I used a famous poem by Sadi, and which is about a collective action and collective healing. So the gist of the poem is that, if one person in a community is suffering, everyone is going to suffer. We're all part of part of the same body, basically. That's the gist of it. So I kind of translated that into this. I don't know if you can see the figures. They're kind of all blended in, but there are multiple figures that they're all made of these parts and pieces of the poem. So that was, to me, an exciting moment, again, to work with what I'm most familiar with, but at the same time, there are opportunities that I get to work with languages that or different other diaspora communities that I'm also learning quite a bit from, and again, creating bonds across communities. That is something important to me. This was a publication called Aleph by Tirza Goldenberg, who is a writer and a poet, currently based in Washington State. And she wrote this beautiful piece about Aleph, the first letter of Hebrew, and wrote a poetry. I actually designed a typeface. There's a custom typeface that I designed for this publication. It was a very amazing experience working with her and just learning from her, but I'm also partly because I'm very interested in different languages, but also as a way to kind of connect with another diaspora sort of community and their understanding of their heritage. Another example was working with a curator and artist who is originally from the Netherlands, Lara Schoor, that I mentioned earlier, was a contributor of the journal. She's also an editor of her own journal. It's called Close Distance. And it's about work in progress, but it's a very sort of expansive framework where she includes mostly work by artists that are displaced or moving across borders continuously. So you would read a piece, for instance, by a Mexican-American artist who talks about their nightmares about being stuck at the Mexican border, southern border. I mean, there are like quite a few pieces that, you know, deal with this idea of like border and border regimes. And again, this was a very exciting opportunity to collaborate, like thinking about the format. So of course, this is, as a journal, this is a very strange format to have a, we still don't know what to call it. Like sometimes we refer to it as like a scarf. Sometimes we think of it as a placemat or like a, what is it, like a table, like sheet, or I'm sorry, I'm totally blanking on words now. But something that has this quality of being transformed to different things depending on your interest and ways that you can, you know, understand this object. You can interact with it in different ways. And that's how we were thinking about, like, you know, language that should be mutable, should, you know, should transform, should be able to, you know, not only transform the reader, but also transform as a language, like its own sort of, the way it kind of refers to certain meanings or multiplicity of meanings. And this one, just kind of wrapping up the talk, this was another commission by the Art Biennial, or International Art Biennial in South Korea, that they selected a few artists around the world to design flags. And to me, designing a flag is a very strange project. I cannot help but think about like issues of coloniality, and that is kind of embedded in certain ways in these, you know, in this particular object. So to question that notion, I was thinking about what it means to have a flag that is transnational, that is not about a particular set of borders or particular identities, but it's about, you know, all the humans, you know, everyone, everywhere, you know, at the same time, basically. So this kind of became the impetus for creating this flag, and the content is basically inspired by Rosie Bradotti. I don't know, not sure if you're familiar with the author, theorist, who talks extensively or has written extensively about post-human identities. But she basically talks about how the future of our planet is, our planet has evolved to a degree that, you know, the four elemental forces that we, you know, are familiar with, you know, water, fire, soil, you know, air, and all that, have transformed to a new sets of forces, which she calls geo-hydro-solar biotechno. So those are the forces that actually kind of run the planet, and I mean, it's obviously more complicated than that, but I was basically trying to hint at those, you know, forces that shape our contemporary condition and societies in this format of a transnational flag. So just to wrap it up, I love this phrase by David Graeber. If you're familiar with him, his writing, he self-identifies as an anarchist theorist, but I'm sure you've seen his writing, or he's been referred to a lot. But one thing that is really exciting to me whenever I come across this particular quote is that the future is something that we build. I mean, the world that we've built so far is something that we've done, and we can also imagine the world differently. And I think that's very empowering to me, because especially at the moment where we all feel disempowered, that we can't take control of things, that everything is run by corporations, governments, and we have very little role in that. I think this is a very helpful or hopeful, I should say, sentiment kind of, moving forward. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you so much. That was beautiful and incredibly fascinating.
Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. So I will kind of circulate the room and pass you the mic to anyone who has a question. I can kick it off. So, as I was listening to your talk and looking at your work, I noticed that there's a real through line of collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
So whether it's your contributors for your journal that you're publishing, or somebody's writing that you're translating graphically, there's a lot of that kind of back and forth and ultimately dialogue. So I kept thinking about just that relationship to language again, like it goes right back to the core theme of your work. And so I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit more about like the nature of your collaborations and that kind of back and forth as the work develops.
Yeah, great question. I guess a lot of the journal is kind of a strange project in that I'm very interested in particular work that is being done outside of my field, like outside of graphic design for the most part. A lot of the contributors are artists, sometimes curators, linguists. And they're people that I'm aspiring to. Like I appreciate their work, but I'm also very much interested in being in conversation with them and understanding their work. So that's kind of how the platform has shaped over time, by basically me reaching out to people that I admire and ask them about their interest in collaboration. And that's exactly why I mentioned that. It's important to me that this is a self-initiated project. In certain ways, it's very selfish. I'm very much interested in very specific things, and it doesn't really. I guess I didn't go into it like thinking like, oh, who's gonna buy this? I didn't even think anyone would be interested, because I thought, who cares about what I'm interested in? Or people that I'm interested in, their works. But surprising, I was really surprised by just seeing like how people just, embrace the idea and just kind of, it just happens so that especially at the times where you feel completely misunderstood and lonely in the world, and you're like, I don't even know if anyone understands what I'm talking about or what I'm interested in or what I care about. I think through collective action, through collective collaboration, that's something that, that's where you actually can, surface some of these interests that might be more, I guess, common than you might think as a designer. At least that's what I've come to understand through this particular project, through conversations and collaborations. I don't know if that answers the question, but
that's great. Thank
yeah.
you.
Thank you for your talk. It was wonderful, especially the Iranian poets and artists at the beginning. I think all the students should be familiar with their work. They're just amazing. It felt to me that the idea of the transnational, which is a great word because it's the umbrella, it can become anything specifically. It's this idea of articulation of someone's language, but also the struggling with it, but also finding oneself in it, and is an opening up in a way, right, towards communication, right? And a lot of your work felt not as this idea, this dialogue between figure and ground, or positive and negative space. So there is a duality that can become multiplicity. Does color play any role in your work at all? A lot of the pieces we saw was black and white, and Shirin Nishad does the same thing. And I'm just wondering if that's something. It's strong enough, right? But in graphic design, but also as in architecture and anywhere else in terms of visual communication, we always talk about color as sort of a potential layer of information. Do you have any, I wonder if you have any thoughts about that at all?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thanks for the question. Surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, this question almost comes up every time I give a talk. Yes, I've been asked many times, like, why. The funny thing is that even if I show work that have some, color in it, I still get the question because majority of my work is black and white. There are quite a few reasons, sometimes depending on the context of the work. But sometimes, there's sometimes purely aesthetic choice. And I guess in a way, it's, for me, as a typographer, I'm very much kind of trained in that world of like high contrast, especially when you're dealing with language and typography. It's just like, that's all you're focused on, form, so much more than like, all these other additional layers. And to me, it's been helpful because I can very much limit my focus to something that I can be very intentional about. And I don't want to say objective because I don't think objectivity really exists, but I can basically more in control of the message to a certain degree. But there are also there are moments where, for instance, in the publishing scenario, there are multiple other layers to it. So environmentally, I would say black and white or black ink is more friendly, environmental friendly. The other reason is cost of publishing. Color is like dramatically colorful. There's all these layers.
No, you bring up these other dimensions that
right.
we don't think of immediately when we
right.
write. We're going to do this and this, but it's such an intentionality too.
Yeah.
Cost is a big one, right?
Yeah.
Environment, it's another one that we might not think of specifically. So that's great.
Thank you. Yeah. It's it has some different I guess aspects to it. It is not that I'm against color by any means. It's I think it's certainly something that I've has been ingrained in my sense of aesthetics, and it's something that it is a constraint too, for sure. Yeah, it does help me to kind of narrow down and start with something, because if you have all the options in the world, like where would you even start, right? But I also think of color as, again, like one another layer that needs to be very intentional. And I think it just, in my mind, I feel like if I use color just for the sake of using color, and I don't have a really intentional meaning behind it, it just seems like, I don't know. I don't want to say superficial, but it just seems like it's not really doing something that I maybe intend to do, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Great. Other questions?
I was just curious. So obviously, there's like a long history of publishing and printing being sort of a means of democratizing communication and sort of using familiar channels of disseminating information. Do you see typography and especially type design as sort of an extension of kind of reclaiming like those tools and those means of communication?
It's a great question. Yes, for sure. Actually, one thing that I was thinking about, sorry, this might be a bit of a sidetrack, because this lecture series is called Technology and Design. Is that what the title is?
Designed by technology.
Designed by technology. Yes. So the one thing that came to my mind, because so much of my work is focused on typography and language, but we hardly ever talk about language as technology. But I think it's very important that we think of it that way, and also typography also as these like extensions of ourselves. You know, when you think about communication and other ways in which language is utilized. Yes, so to answer your question, I think, I mean, I see all of them sort of, you know, very much connected in a certain way. I mean, to me, typography, especially now, what is really exciting about what is happening in the field of typography and graphic design is that we are seeing a lot of, you know, languages being, you know, taken more seriously. Like there are many typefaces that are being designed across, you know, different regions in the world, and that to me is I want to say has changed dramatically like over the past 10 years. Like I don't remember like having access to so many like Farsi and Arabic typefaces, and very well done typefaces too, that support all kinds of like, you know, random glyphs that you could possibly think of. Especially from where I come from, it's, you know, that has been a serious problem, because, you know, there's been the choices have been always very limiting. So in that case, I mean, that situation, I think it has dramatically helped. Like the evolution of typography and technology has dramatically helped publishing in many ways. I don't know if that's answering your question, but that's where my mind was going. But now, especially, I'm thinking that this is going to be also the future of publishing and graphic design, a multiplicity of languages. And I mean, you can see it a lot more these days. Like when you go to museums, for instance, you see that exhibitions are not just being, you know, not everything is on display with just a simple English description. I'm actually, as a matter of fact, I'm working with a museum in Chicago where they're showing work by Iranian artists. And it's quite a bit of a challenge to have, you know, we're incorporating 3 languages into this exhibition. So it's like Farsi, English, and Spanish. And so this is just like, I think this is just the beginning. I mean, when you think about many other languages, like indigenous languages, I mean, I'm hoping we get to the, you know, point where, you know, the evolution of technology can help the revival of many, I shouldn't say dead languages. I think the proper term is sleeping languages that have been either like colonized or have been marginalized in one way or another. I think this is an exciting time where, you know, those can all be like, reproduced or yeah, I mean, there's opportunity to bring them back to life. I don't know if that does that answer yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the
Sure.
wonderful talk and discussion. Let's give it up for Pouya.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you.
Sure.
Really
My pleasure.
inspiring. So much to think about.